Recognized organizations in the Marshall Islands. In fact, this is a very historic first occasion. The first time that the United Nations has sat a delegate from the Marshall Islands at the Human Rights Council. The first time that Marshallese citizens have been able to come and share their experiences, especially their experiences with human rights, environment, and health, to the Human Rights Council. We celebrate and savor this day, and again, thank you and welcome. All told, by U.S. estimates, some 6.3 billion curies of radioiodine-131 were released into the atmosphere as a result of testing in the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. That's just a number, 6.3 billion. Consider a few other numbers. 42 times greater than the 150 million curies released in Nevada. Okay. 150 million curies were released in Nevada. Again, 6.3 billion in the Marshall Islands. It's 150 times greater than the 40 million curies estimated to have been released from Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It's unclear what it relates to in terms of Fukushima, but for the same reasons why the Fukushima nuclear disaster is causing so much emanation and concern, this long-going constant emission into the atmosphere and into the marine environment, the Marshallese experienced that. Indeed, they experienced with 67 nuclear weapon tests over a 12-year period. They are one of the most polluted places on the planet as a result. I have long remarks. I'm going to cut them short so that we have more time in this panel to listen to the Marshallese. In this panel, we explore these health and human rights issues of nuclear militarism, and our speakers include two community survivors from Rongelap, the community that was immediately downwind from the Bravo test in 1954, thermonuclear bomb. Anthropologists such as myself and Dr. Holly Barker, and other scientists such as Dr. Busby. We're here to consider both the historical events and consequences, including heavily contaminated environment, human subject experimentation, health and reproductive problems, problems with displacement, loss of a sustainable way of life, and some of the many challenges of providing meaningful reparation. In addition to, as I mentioned, Dr. Holly Barker, myself, Barbara Rose Johnston, we have the senator from Kwajalein, Mr. Jaban Ricklon, and Mrs. Lemoyo Ebon, a retired teacher and actually the leader of the Marshall Islands' first NGO, ERUB, E-R-U-B, which she will talk more about. Also in the audience are several people from the Marshall Islands, and I believe that we'll see some more folks coming in. And then finally, the final member sitting up here is the former senator from Rongelap and the minister of, how should I say, the chief of community development for the Department of Interior in the Marshall Islands, Abaka Anjay Madison. In terms of our NGO sponsorship, we give thanks to Cultural Survival, to Physicians for Social Responsibility, the American Anthropological Association, the International Women's Anthropology Conference, and to Reaching Critical Will, and the International League for Peace and Freedom. And thank you again to Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, who is here in this room today. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment again to consider the immense historical importance that today is for the Marshallese and for nuclear issues in a human rights context. As I said, it's the first day that Human Rights Council hears a report on the human rights consequences of U.S. nuclear militarism in the Marshall Islands. It's the first time a Marshallese representative of government sat in that council. It's the first time a Marshallese citizen was able to offer a statement and share their experiences with the council. Being here today is a result of decades and decades and decades of advocacy and activism from people who live halfway around the world, in a water world, 77 square miles of land, an area the size of Mexico. The immense nature of persistent advocacy. And sadly, because of these people who are not with us today, we celebrate their memory. And so I want to just say thank you to Nelson Anjay, the late Nelson Anjay. Thank you to the late John Anjay. Thank you to advocates like Dr. Rosalie Bertel, who went and helped document health effects in the Marshall Islands in the 80s and continue to publish on that behalf. But most especially, thank you to Lijan Eknelan, who recently passed August 24th at the age of 66. Because of Lijan Eknelan and her travels to various farms, including the World Uranium Court in its first hearing, but also the Hague Tribunal. It was her testimony that helped get the first declaration of recognition that nuclear militarism is a violation of international humanitarian law. So the Marshallese have played a big role in the anti-nuclear movement. They've played a big role in the creation of the indigenous environmental justice movement, and we are very happy and pleased to finally have an opportunity to be at the UN and secure assistance. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Holly Barker, who will do a brief overview that's illustrated to give you a visual content.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Johnston. The screen's coming down. I'm going to show some images, and I'm hopefully not going to use the microphone. Can everybody hear my voice okay if I speak out? Okay. Okay. Apologies in advance. I think some of the formatting changed a little bit from my computer in Seattle to moving here. But I wanted you to have some images of the Marshall Islands because sitting here in Geneva, we're very far removed from the context of the issues that we're talking about. To give you some visuals of what happened in the Marshall Islands. And so I'm assuming that not everybody is an expert on Marshall Islands issues, so just starting from the beginning. Just so you know where the Marshall Islands is, it's in the northern Pacific, about halfway between Hawaii and Japan, where that star is located on the global map. And to the right is a map of the Marshall Islands. And if I could point out briefly just the two ground zero weapon locations where the two where the detonations occurred were on Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok Atoll. And the community testifiers from today were on Rongelap Atoll, which is the inhabited atoll that was closest to the testing program, including the Bravo shots. All of the testing took place in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958, when the United States was the administrating authority for a United Nations Trust territory of the Pacific Islands. The Marshallese then petitioned the United Nations to stop the testing because they were so concerned about the impacts that it was having. And the United Nations allowed that testing to continue and said that it was imperative. So that's the reason that we're back here at the United Nations. And I'll just go through some pictures, again, to give you some idea. There were 67 weapons tests conducted in the Marshall Islands. All of them were above ground to produce as much radioactive fallout as possible in the Marshall Islands so that the United States could then test the military effects. What does radiation do to human beings? What does it do to the environment, animals, plants? So that it could understand that information and apply it to military intelligence to help grow the strength of the U.S. military. People live in these lands that were affected by 67 different tests, and so there's a cumulative and a chronic impact that takes place, yet the U.S. only recognizes that one test, the Bravo test, caused any damage whatsoever. Again, just to give you a few images, the country is just 70 square miles of land. And land, as in many indigenous cultures, including Pacific Island cultures, is critical. It's central. The whole culture and society is based on the land. And so when there's so little of it, the impacts are felt very strongly. To give you an equivalent, the Bravo test that was tested on March 1st, 1954 is the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. So if you detonated 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, you would get the one bomb in the Marshall Islands, which is the Bravo test. And there are still 66 tests on top of that, giving us cumulative radiation exposure over many years. To give you an idea of how the military applications were happening, to the right there is an image of an island within Eniwetok Atoll. And to the left there is a picture of a crater that was left from where the lands were actually vaporized. And the U.S. would then correlate that information and say how many Pentagon buildings, which is the hub of U.S. Department of Defense, could be taken out by this weapon. And so all of the experimentation going on with the weapons was directly used for the military, to strengthen the military of the U.S. government. There was also medical research going on. And I think as some of the speakers are going to talk about later, after the Bravo event, when people were exposed to radiation, without their consent or knowledge, they were enrolled in a top secret medical program to study and research the effects of radiation on human beings. And that includes people who were exposed to fallout after the bomb, but also people who were purposely put in contaminated islands so that the U.S. could then study how the people were taking radiation out of their environments. And we've got some great speakers who will elaborate on that. This is a picture on the right that shows a Marshallese woman who was enrolled on the bottom in that Project 4.1 just a couple of weeks after the Bravo event. Also underscoring kind of the medical research aspect of it, there was a control group that was established too. So in addition to people who were exposed to fallout from the bombs, the U.S. government set up a control group where it matched people by gender and age to the people who are in the inhabited atolls near the detonation sites. Again, to give you an idea of what it looks like when the lands are obliterated. So right now the Marshall Islands is 70 square miles of land. It used to be 77 square miles of land. 7 square miles have been completely vaporized out of the country because of the bombs. They dissipated, and there are the craters that are left there. Again, in many indigenous communities, like Pacific Island cultures, they rely greatly on having healthy resources in their environment for their culture to survive. And so when radiation gets into the food chain and into the plants that people use for food, for medicines, for houses, then the radiation compromises every aspect of life. The research that the United States government conducted on the Marshallese people, the medical research that they conducted, was very specifically for military applications. The U.S. wanted to know if the United States was hit by a nuclear weapon during the Cold War, what would the effect be on civilians? Or if U.S. soldiers were exposed to radiation, what would the effect be? Most of the male exposed soldiers at the time were males, and so there tended to be, within the research, a white male, highly educated bias in terms of creating research agendas. And as a special rapporteur noticed, women and children were almost completely overlooked in terms of understanding how radiation affects people. And so, as our speakers are going to talk about later today, there were profound health implications that were never really important or understood, or that information wasn't sought out. The research that took place in the Marshall Islands was extremely dehumanizing. It wasn't for the benefit of the Marshallese. It was only to further the military goals of the United States government. Here's a quote here on the left from somebody that we interviewed to explain what it felt like to be enrolled in a medical experiment program. It was called a health care program, but it actually was an experimentation program. And here's a quote there. "We never knew what was going on. There was a time when they took my blood, mixed it with something, and then shot it back into me. They never asked me if they could do this, they just did it. I didn't understand what they were doing, and I still don't." And so that quote sort of shows how people don't have any understanding. There's not any consent involved. There's not any translation that's involved. There's no medical record to say what took place. And it also shows the ambiguity. They're just research subjects rather than people who are getting medical care. This woman has taken part in U.S. health care for the radiation effects for all of her life since the testing program. So Marshallese, because, again, like many indigenous communities, they know their land and their islands the best. They've been living there for centuries, for generations. And so they have an intricate science that's based on their own observations of the land around them. They've seen it change. They know what's different now and how it's very different than it used to be. For instance, foods that people have always eaten all their lives after the nuclear testing caused blisters in their mouth or caused them to get epilepsy, like seizures. And so these are things that had never happened in their communities beforehand. Again, thinking about the centrality of land, which is something, I'm a Westerner, so I don't really have that kind of tie the way indigenous communities like the Marshallese do. Here's a quote from a chief in the Marshall Islands, Mike Kabua, who talks about the essentialness of the land. If you're not tied to your land, then you can't show respect to elders, you lose your authority, you lose all ties to your customs. And so when people are displaced from their land, it's not just that they don't have a place to reside that's their own, it's that their entire culture is taken away from them. When you live on somebody else's land in the Marshall Islands, you don't have the same access to cultivate resources or carry out your cultural obligations. One of the biggest human rights violations that have been noted by the report is sort of the absence of adequate health care in the Marshall Islands. And again, the report focuses on women and children, but it extends much further than that. We know that radiation exposure causes cancer and highly increases people's likelihood of contracting cancer. In the Marshall Islands today, in the year 2012, the testing ended in 1958, there is no oncologist in the Marshall Islands. So there's no cancer doctor that resides in the Marshall Islands. You cannot get chemotherapy treatment in the Marshall Islands. So if you get cancer in the Marshall Islands, and you're not one of the very few people that the United States acknowledges is affected by radiation and therefore entitled to a health care program, your only option for getting cancer care is to leave the country. You have to actually go outside of the country to get cancer care in the Marshall Islands. And so this is a dramatic example of how extensive the human rights violations have been in the Marshall Islands. And when the Marshallese have to send their sick people overseas, it tears apart families at the time when they need to be together the most to try to support people going through their health problems. In addition to no oncologists, the report notes that there are mental health aspects of radiation which are really profound, sort of the fears that go along with that. There's no psychiatrist in the Marshall Islands. There are no mental health programs. There's no mental health psychiatric medication that's available in the Marshall Islands. The healthcare system is extremely rudimentary. The intergenerational effects are profound, but none of the children in the Marshall Islands are eligible for any health care associated with the radiation exposure. Even though they're born on highly contaminated atolls, even though the DNA of their parents has been altered by the radiation exposure. There are no programs for people with disabilities outside of the school system. So the school system has a special education program, but because of the profound both mental and physical disabilities that comes from radiation exposure, since radiation is mutagenic, there is no program support. And so this is just a partial list of the lack of support programs that are available in the Marshall Islands. I'll leave this slide to when the speakers talk today to talk about the burdens of resettlement, because I think hearing it from the first person from people who have experienced this themselves is key. But it's again that tied to the land and the sense of place and what happens when you can't be on your own community's land. Thank you. I'm almost done. And quickly, just as a couple of comparisons, the report also notes that it's not just the past military actions in the Marshall Islands that have caused problems. It's also some of the current day military activities and the lack of transparency and lack of knowledge that is given to the Marshallese. Right now, there's a $4 billion missile testing research facility in the Marshall Islands. So the United States can harness immense financial resources for its current military interests, yet it cannot seem to muster the political will or the financial resources to address the military issues of the past. And so we see huge amounts of money going into current military needs while the past military consequences are being completely overlooked. And we see that too in the bodies of the Marshallese. Numerous Marshallese are putting on American uniforms and helping to defend the United States. their healthy bodies are wanted in the US military, but the bodies of those who have been deformed or who are sick from the nuclear tests are not wanted. And so the violence of that testing program continues. And I'll just leave with this last image, and I think some of the speakers will talk about this, but the intergenerational effects are profound. This is a third-generation child born, so it's the granddaughter of somebody who had been exposed to radiation. Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Senator Jaban Ricklin. Sir? What do you say? Well, you have an opportunity to talk about in greater detail what you didn't get to talk about in the council. The mic is yours to share. I think so.
We must say, we have heard a great deal of facts being presented by these two doctors, Dr. Johnston, Dr. Barber, about what happened on Roundup after the Bravo shot conducted in 1954. This morning, I made a statement. Unfortunately, I was unable to finish it with time constraint. But if I may continue to finish it, having this opportunity now, I will be glad to complete it if you are interested to listen to it. Although I'm not too sure where I stop, I'll try and continue whatever I have here in front of me to complete the statement. I'll start from my page 3. I nearly completed it, but it was unfortunate that I could not finish it with the time limit allowable for me to present my statement. The U.S. government also established a control group to compare those of us who were exposed to radiation from the Bravo test. Designated controls were children who live in Mayoro Atoll, in the southern part of our nation. There were people who did not live on Roundup in 1954, but moved back after repatriation in 1957, and they were the residents of Udruk, some 200 miles downwind, an atoll heavily contaminated by fallout, Bravo fallout. In these human radiation experiments, we Marshallese were matched by gender and age, and all of us, so-called exposed and controls, were forced to participate in studies and painful procedures that were not for medical benefit, including, for example, bone marrow extraction. When subjects resisted, the U.S. government sometimes brought in the territorial government police to forcefully remove necessary children from their schools and homes to ensure that they are available to the U.S. scientists. My community was returned in 1957 to our highly contaminated home islands with great happiness and international attention. We live in Roundup Atoll under the illusion that all was well. In fact, the U.S. Advisory Commission on Human Radiation and the Marshall Islands Nuclear Claim Tribunal findings have confirmed we were returned to a highly contaminated environment where scientists studied the movement and accumulation of radiation through the marine and island environment and through our bodies to document the long-term human health impacts of radiation exposure. To increase participation in the medical research, we were offered money, candy, cigarettes, special privileges like watching TV, a movie on a naval ship. After several years, I decided to stop participating in the medical survey experiments or take the pills the U.S. doctors gave me because I felt these interactions were the benefit of the U.S. and not for me. The U.S. doctors told that I needed to be closely monitored because of my exposure. If I stopped, I would not be eligible for treatment if I develop a cancer or disease from radiation exposure in the future. These experiments suggest that a small portion of the suffering that the people of the Marshall Islands have endured under the nuclear testing and related military use of our nation. The fallout from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons tests in the Cold War, as well as missile tests and other activities in recent years, have introduced new and foreign elements into our small island nation, contaminating the very means that support our unique and previously sustainable way of life. I'm grateful to the Special Rapporteur for investigating these human rights violations and recommending action steps for the U.S., the RMI, and the international community. I also appreciate the commitment of the RMI government to address the needs of the nuclear test survivors. All humans have right to life, to a life with dignity, and to a life where environmental health ensures a sustainable future. We strongly believe with confidence and trust that this body, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, can take action to establish improvements to our human right, to life, future, our human dignity, and the health of our environment to help us regain a sustainable way of life. I'll stop here. If you have any question for me that I'll be able to answer, I'll be glad to do that. Thank you.
Just as an additional caveat, Senator is the Senator for Kwajalein as well as a member of the Rongelap community. Many of the Rongelap community live in Kwajalein Atoll. So we will take questions. We have a minute or two. If anyone has any direct questions you'd like to direct to the Senator.
Please.
My name is Tom Miles. I'm a journalist for Reuters News Agency. I hope you don't think this question is flippant or silly. I mean it quite seriously, but I wonder, you probably know Geneva is a member not just the Human Rights Council, but also to numerous bodies covering intellectual property. I'm wondering if you think you have a claim against the United States for the intellectual property that they have derived from this medical research. I mean, the Human Rights Council famously has no power, really, but to recommend, whereas a legal claim on intellectual property might have a bit more punch. Have you done that? Would you consider it? Thank you.
Other than personal injury claims, we have also claims for property damage and bad use of our islands. So it's all in our claim that has been prepared by the Nuclear Claim Tribunal established by the United States and the government of the Marshall Islands under the first Compact of Free Association. That Nuclear Claim Tribunal is now being defunct because of no funding available.
Sorry, just to follow up, what I really mean is the information, the knowledge. The United States is obviously a world leader in the technology of how to deal with nuclear fallout. The Marshall Islands, I guess, is not. The Marshall Islands presumably has a claim to that knowledge, that data, that information, and could sell that to other countries around the world who want the same information. It's held in the United States. Why does the Marshall Islands not make a claim to that information?
That's a very good question, sir. I think from my own point of view, my own opinions, now that we have reached this level, I think we need the international attention to be involved in this effort related to the nuclear United States nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. And I think that's the main another main concentration is to attract the international attention to this problem.
If I may add just a caveat, with a very small population and limited agendas, for the last couple of decades, much of the political attention for assistance has been focused on the bilateral relationship and the mechanisms set in place. Thus, going through the Nuclear Claims Tribunal process was part of the Compact of Free Association that gave them their independence. In terms of securing an actual remedy, when those agreements were not fully acted upon, they went through the U.S. courts, and they went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, earlier lower courts confirmed fully the injustices of their complaints, but said they had no standing since they were no longer citizens. They had no right to go to U.S. courts. Hence, this Human Rights Council hearing is their first, and many people believe the court of last resort. Your idea is a very excellent idea, and we'll take note, and no, it hasn't, to my knowledge, been the idea of a claim against the U.S. for intellectual property has not been considered. I think, though, given the capacity issues, it's one step at a time. Did I mistake? Okay. Is there any other questions? Or we should move on. Then our next speaker is Mrs. Leboyo Aban. The mic is yours, Madame.
I grew up there in Iraq since then. I was 14 years old by that time. They just tested the pump. And during that time, we were not, they didn't tell us what happened. They didn't tell us that they are going to, there is a plantation that will happen. So all the people there, we were just going around doing our own works. And at 6:30, we see the light. We see the bright light or the brightening sun of that. And for the children, they were running around looking for their mother because they didn't know what happened. And all those, during all the years, we didn't know what will, that all the distance were affected our lives. But not until 1970 that we know that our island is dangerously damaged by the radiation. So, since we are not doctors, scientists, we don't have that, we didn't really care about this until some of the one they like we have first they just told us the story of our radiation was within our people. And how will they affect their lives? And nowadays, some years ago, we were told that they are going to take us back. And to us, it's very dangerous because we don't know anything about radiation. How will we be there? How will we get our food? Since if all the island is damaged by radiation. And that's why we came here. Yes. This, all of you, the delegates who are here to help us find a way that we'll be working together to end this kind of damage. So, I don't know if what I say is the one. So if there is question, just free to ask me.
So, Abuka, do you have any questions to ask Mrs. Leboyo Aban? Or does anyone here in the audience have some questions to ask? Because
we have a very knowledgeable person here on the experiences of women, of health, children, as a former teacher, retired teacher, on the issues of what is it, how do you attend to the basic human dignities? Any questions? Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. The question is this, and it's not only to you, but would it be possible for people to remember, like you have remembered, things that happened back then? So if one did a questionnaire study, if one asked, not an awful lot of questions, but say 2 pages of questions, do you think that people would remember whether somebody died or whether somebody didn't have a baby or whether there was a miscarriage? Because people do tend to remember things that happen in their own lives. Do you think that that would be possible to get some sort of idea if there was such a study? Would that be possible, or is it too long ago?
Would that be already if I just write down what I wrote on my space? See? On March 1st, 1954, I was 14 years old living on Geneva. This was the day I was experiencing injustice. It was the day they deprived me of peace. The farm I could name Bravo was exploded on Virginia, just 180 kilometers away from Roma. Unlike other nuclear weapons, this is about the previous 8 years, there was no warning given to the people on Roma and other town of the blast. I was playing with the poisonous debris from the farm family. I didn't know what it was, but because it looked like so, I began playing with it. But suddenly it burned my eyes and mouth. Later in the evening, I was sick. The people on the island were very sick, especially the children. The next day, my skin was torn off and covered with sores. I had burned skin so badly in I was in pain. My hair started to fall off. After 2 days of drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food, and breathing the contaminated air, we were evacuated by the US. On not being rescued by taking the receipt, abandoning the question at all, put in the injustice, but no, that was just me. Much more inhuman treatment was yet to be bestowed upon us. After evacuation, we began subsequent study in a top secret research program that documented but did not treat our injuries. The studies continued and expanded when we returned to home island 3 years later. We twice a year visit from scientists who reprove and sample and documented the changes in our bodies in the research about that continue for decades. In my community, we did not learn until the 1970s that our homeland was dangerously contaminated with nuclear fallout. Realizing our lives and future were being destroyed, we asked the US government to evacuate us. They refused. And finally, in 1985, we received the help of British, and we abandoned our home island, our foreign position. This deeply disturbing history has immense and painful consequences. To this day, women in the Marshall Island prefer to salvage babies or babies with no bones in their bodies and transparent skin. Sometimes they are born alive and live for a few minutes or hours. And you can see the blood moving through their bodies before they die. We give birth to babies with missing limbs or their organ and spinal cords on the outside of their bodies. We never experienced this type of birth before the US testing program. We have complained about this birth for decades, and we are always told by the US government that they are not the result of radiation exposure. Yet, our language, our history, and our stories have no record of these birds before the testing program. After the testing program, we had to create new words to describe the pressure we keep birth to, and for those that survive, we have few resources to provide a life with dignity. Today in the Marshall Islands, there is no oncologist to treat the many cancers that have become too common in our lives. Chemotherapy or radiation treatment for cancer does not exist in the Marshall Islands, so we have to leave the community for treatment. This tears our family apart when we need to be together the most. Because of US denies that our radiation exposure have affected the health of children and their children. Only a few people are eligible for government-funded medical treatment for their radiogenic cancer disease and condition. We believe, like other indigenous nations, that it is our sacred duty to sustain the land and to take care of future generations so they can thrive and given many challenges of attending to health and welfare in a nation compromised by its service as a nuclear weapon providing ground. We welcome the existence of the United States and the international community, especially if that existence allows us to achieve adequate health care in a safe and secure environment. We kept the world knowledge of the ways that radiation can destroy a human being. Yet, today we see our cultural ways of life sorely affected by the loss of our beloved homes and our people plagued by UNESCO's radiation. Our experience that nuclear fallout create damage that endure and expand. Yet, the assistance program continues to contract and deny. As an island may be intermediate with radioactive soil, land, and deep residue removed, but is it? In our culture, we rely on the well of many islands to get access to the food, medicine, housing, water, and other resources. A single coral island, the Marshall cannot support the community. And a partial cleanup of an island is not the same as restoring our own lands. The nuclear survival of Beirut and the Marshall Islands brought the investigation of the rapporteur into the human rights violations connected to the US testing of nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. And we welcome its recommendation that the United States should fully fund the work made through the RMA Nuclear Claims Tribunal, expand medical assistance program, assess in building a natural healthcare system that can attend to the legacy of nuclear testing and allows to access and restore our security contamination. We have a saying, if not us, who? We have to help now. We have to let peace prevail. This is our time for the future of our children and grandchildren. I urge this council, the member of the United Nations, to take action to not only help us help ourselves, but to make sure that such miseries do not occur ever again. Thank you.
Yeah, a long answer, a very important statement. Thank you, Mrs. Edholm. I noticed that Mr. Bill Graham came into the room as well, who's the public advocate for the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. I know that there are a number of members of the press here who have questions and so forth, especially on the nuclear options, the political options and so forth. So I urge your voice to chime in, Bill, if a question is asked. that you can assist with. The way, and as I said, this is fairly informal, in part because after our statements today, this morning, the council, the press, the UN press office took me aside and said they were putting out some information about this. And the Marshallese delegation expanded yesterday with the arrival of another 4 people from the Marshall Islands. So we do have a lot of input and opportunities to share, and apologies for the relatively loose structure of this. Abaka, did you have a comment that you wanted to make? Yeah? Okay. Then I do invite any of the Marshall Islands delegation that is in the room, if you have any comments to make. Yeah? Do you have any comments to make or on these issues?
I don't know what I would comment about specifically, other than to just say that I think in response to the comment that Senator Jevon made, I think that that's pretty accurate about what at least the U.S. government's view of the legal status of any claims for damage is concerned. The question about the intellectual property, that's a very intriguing one. But I think, like a lot of the claims of the people of the Marshall Islands for personal injuries, for property damage resulting from the nuclear testing program, until and unless you have an attorney who is willing to represent you in those claims, you're not going to get very far. Those people got screwed pretty bad during the negotiations for the settlement because certain groups had attorneys who were doing a fairly good job of representing those particular groups, and other people did not have such representation, and so their claims were basically dismissed during the negotiations. It's like a lot of other things in life. If you're not well represented, you're not going to come out very well. I think there may be some people that would be interested in seeking some damages for the knowledge that the U.S. developed about nuclear weapons and any other aspects of atomic energy things as a result of the testing that was done in the Marshall Islands. But whether there would be any court that would consider it has jurisdiction. There were courts in the U.S. who were quite happy to hear and considered that the claims of the Marshall Islanders had validity, except for the fact that they had no jurisdiction. Such jurisdiction was specifically removed under the terms of the settlement agreement, which is a very one-sided agreement. It was based on knowledge that one side had and ignorance that the other side had about a number of things. So I think perhaps if there are more specific questions I might be able to address, but that's about as much as I can say right now on a general basis.
Thank you. On our program, our final speaker is Dr. Busby, who's here to talk in many ways about the science at issue that helped create these unbalanced relationships or limited definitions of health and health effect. And Chris, do you want to come up here so people can see you?
Yes, and then we can point the camera so that I get that in the background. But I would like to ask a question to the gentleman from the nuclear claims.
Bill, yeah, the public advocate for the nuclear claims tribunal.
This is a question, and it's a question that's arisen in a number of court cases that I've been involved in the United Kingdom relating to the nuclear test veterans who were exposed at the British test in Christmas Island, Marianga, Australia, and so on. The question has to do with new science. Now, if a settlement is made in the court, say in 1980, relating to arguments that were heard at that time, in which a certain scientific viewpoint was put forward, which allowed the judges to make decisions after all the discussions took place. Now the question is, what happens if the science changes? This is the question. I mean, what's the legal situation? Because actually this is exactly what's happened. Science has changed. So all of the basic understanding of the science of radiation risk that existed in the 1980s is completely been turned on its head in the last 20 years, and increasingly so as more and more evidence comes forward. So see, certainly in terms of justice, it now is quite clear that settlements that were made 20, 30 years ago would have been unjust had the science that we now know been applied at that time. That's the question. I mean, so is there anything that can be done? That's the question.
Let me qualify my response first and foremost by saying that I am not an attorney. Although I represented the claimants as the public advocate, a statutory position at the Nuclear Claims Tribunal responsible for representing all claims, claimants could obtain their own private counsel if they chose. Most did not, because our office was free. But we had a part-time attorney that would assist us from time to time. I wound up basically representing all personal injury claimants because the tribunal adopted an administrative approach similar to the Downwinders program. And I represented most of the claimants in the Raw case and did most of the work with the assistance of Dr. Barker and Dr. Johnston and Ms. Anjay Madison, and certainly members of the Raw community such as Senator Rudlin and Ms. Otten.
So but
the point is that the U.S. courts rejected it on a jurisdictional basis, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So
it wasn't on a scientific basis at all, because I understood.
No, it was simply a legal basis. Sorry, we have a settlement agreement. There is no jurisdiction of any U.S. court. It didn't matter what the legal basis for the claim might have been.
Though, just to add to that, there was two different parallel paths to trying to get remedy. One was through the court system, the other was through a bilateral appealing to Congress because new information had come to light and they had a change circumstance clause in their agreement that said if new information came to light, they had the right to go back to Congress to appeal for change. And when they put in that appeal, the U.S. government rejected the validity of new information, and they do so standing upon the 1980s era in science that you were talking about.
In that case, if that's still possible to go forward, then that seems to me to be quite a reasonable route, because I personally...
Could you speak to the mic, so the room can hear?
I thought maybe I'm loud enough for everybody to hear.
Not for recording.
Yeah?
Not for
Okay.
recording.
All right. Well, basically what I want to say, so is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. But my take-home message, which I'll begin with, is this, that the science that underpins all of the analyses of the exposures of the Marshall Islanders, and indeed an awful lot of other people after Chernobyl and after the Iraq wars and indeed close to nuclear power stations and so on, all of the science that underpins all of this, that permits these circumstances to occur, is wrong.